Welcome to the Silver Screen Guide podcast, where we discuss films from every genre. So sit back, relax, and enjoy the podcast. Welcome, listeners, to our Neill Blomkamp retrospective series. I am your co-host, Corbin.
I'm Allen over here from Chicago.
And this will be our final retrospective series for 2017.
Not the final review of 2017. We have one more after this for Christmas. But then that'll be it for 2017.
Yes, we will have our Christmas special coming out on Christmas, December 25th. That will be It's a Wonderful Life. So make sure to stay tuned for that. But like I said, this will be the last retrospective series we're doing. And we are taking a look at some, visionary science fiction films from, I guess you could say, the relatively new director, Neill Blomkamp. The first installment, as you probably know since you're listening to it, District 9. This is actually Neill Blomkamp's first big screen directorial debut. He had done some short films prior to this, but he kind of received some notoriety for a couple of the short films. And I know one of them was, I think it's called Halo Landfall. And he was actually going to do a Halo film with Peter Jackson. That's why you see Peter Jackson attached to this. But that Halo film has fallen through and it's pretty much dead now, essentially. So that is why they started thinking of other science fiction ideas they could adapt to the big screen together. And in 2006, Neill Blomkamp put out a short film called Alive in Joburg. And it's basically a very small version of District 9. It's not as fleshed out. It's about 6 minutes long. I can't really recommend the short film. I mean, yeah, it's only 6 minutes, but like I said, it's pretty much a very watered down short version of District 9. It's not really worth your 6 minutes. Alan, did you watch it?
I did not. No, I knew that he had short films, but I haven't seen any of them. In fact, the only Neill Blomkamp movie I had seen up until we decided to do this retrospective would have been Elysium. And I watched that one time back when it was released in theaters. I actually saw it at the drive-in with my uncle.
Ah.
So that is, so far in this retrospective, that's the only Neill Blomkamp movie I've ever seen. And so I'm kind of relatively new to this whole thing. But I've definitely heard the name before, and I've heard District 9 before. But I didn't know up until this review that he had also done short films as well.
Yes, and I guess I'm not really new to Neill Blomkamp. I have seen all of his major films, seen none of his short stuff before this retrospective series. The first time that I saw District 9 was actually not that long after it came out, I believe. In 2009, this movie debuted August 14th, 2009. So Neill Blomkamp has not even been on the big directorial scene for 10 years. That's why I said he's relatively new. And like I said, I saw it, I would have been 14 years old. So far too young to see a rated R movie, but I actually saw a heavily edited version of this. So heavily edited, and I didn't really remember anything about it, but I'd probably say about a year or so back, I bought the Neill Blomkamp box set, and it was a digibook box set with all three of his films, really nice cover art, really nice material in the digibook, and all three discs are packed with bonus features, and there's great artwork inside of the digibook with lots of insightful material. I highly recommend picking it up if you are interested in the films, because it's a fairly cheap box set to get. So I bought that about a year ago, and it really wasn't very expensive, and I did go back and watch all of his films in release order. So I'm going to say this is technically my second time. Well, not technically, it's technically my third time, but It's basically my second time watching it, because the first time doesn't count. Really long time ago, and like I said, heavily edited.
Right.
So Neill Blomkamp did not write this movie alone. He wrote it with Terry Tatchell, I believe is how her name is pronounced, and she has pretty much only worked with Neill Blomkamp. Everything she's done is pretty much his stuff. So, and this movie stars Charlton Copley, who is the main character Wikus, and he has been longtime friends with Neill Blomkamp, both from South Africa. David James and Jason Cope, and I know there's more than just those three, but their pictures weren't on IMDb, and I didn't remember their names, so I really wasn't sure who to include, but you get it. So, and like I said, this movie is produced by Peter Jackson, who at this point is a massive name in the film industry because of his massive acclaim from the Lord of the Rings trilogy. Right,
and I remember when District 9 first started, too, and it had Peter Jackson's name on it. I had no idea, and I was like, whoa. It caught me off guard, because I didn't know that he was tied to this movie in any way.
So this is your first time seeing District 9?
Yeah, this is the first time.
Okay. And I do remember around when District 9 came out, there was a lot of buzz about it.
Yeah, there was.
A lot of buzz, a big marketing campaign. I remember lots of people were talking about it. On an episode of Parks and Rec, I remember they were talking about, I rented District 9 tonight. You want to come over and watch it? So It was pretty big, and I too had forgotten Peter Jackson was a part of it. So I was really surprised also when I popped it on, and like one of the first things you see is Peter Jackson Presents. And I was like, oh wow, I forgot Peter Jackson was a part of this. And if I'm correct, you don't even see Neill Blomkamp's name till the end credits. From what I remember, Peter Jackson was front and center.
Yes, it very much was. Peter Jackson was the very first thing that you see in this movie. And I'm sure they did that to kind of show audiences that they're not seeing some random movie and that there's a very familiar name tied to it, which is very fair because Neill Blomkamp, up until this point, has only done short films, and the general audience is not going to go out and watch short films.
Exactly.
That I can think of. So I'm sure it's a smart move for audiences not to just get up and walk out or something like that, or to not like the movie because it's not tied to somebody that they don't know. It kind of, more of that safety kind of thing.
Yes, Peter Jackson is the big draw for this film.
Yes.
And the trailers and everything, they're marketing this as kind of a Peter Jackson movie in a way, even though he did not direct or write. He was just in a producerial capacity, which still is important. But I would say this is more of Neill Blomkamp's baby because he did do that short film 3 years prior to the release of this movie. Well, it is fairly well received on IMDb. It has an 8 on IMDb, which is pretty good, pretty impressive. So in this movie, it has a 90% on Rotten Tomatoes.
That is very certified fresh.
Yeah, that's crazy for a 90% on Rotten Tomatoes. That is a pretty impressive achievement.
Right.
And the audience score is 82%, which is still impressive also.
Oh, yeah.
Well, this movie was pretty well received by the Academy. This movie was nominated for 4 Oscars, and big ones also. Mm-hmm. It did not win any of them. It was nominated for Best Picture, and that award was going towards Peter Jackson. Neill Blomkamp did not have any credit for Best Picture. But Neill Blomkamp was nominated along with Terry Tatchell for Best Writing. The film was also nominated for Best Film Editing and Best Visual Effects. I can't exactly remember what was the Best Picture in 2009.
For the 2009 films, which would have been 2010 when they were awarded, it would have been The Hurt Locker that won Best Picture. Okay. But it's kind of interesting because it was also put up against Avatar, The Blind Side, and Up as all for Best Picture nominees for 2010.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Well, that's interesting. I do own The Hurt Locker. I've only seen it once. That's a film by James Cameron's wife. Mm-hmm. I know she did Zero Dark 30 also. I didn't really like The Hurt Locker, so can't really say I'm too positive that it won out of those other films.
Right. I haven't seen The Hurt Locker. I've definitely heard of it, and I've heard a lot of people talking about it, but I personally have not watched it myself.
Well, the box office for this movie had a small budget of $30 million. But for any other film, especially one with this many nominations and kind of on this marketing scale and release scale, it's a small budget.
It is, yeah.
Domestically, it did great, $115.6 million. Foreign, $95 million for a worldwide total of $210.8 million. So, yeah, it made back its budget tenfold. It's crazy.
Oh, yeah. It made a ton of money, and it kind of put Neill Blomkamp on the map just from his first film alone, which is pretty rare.
That's true. That's pretty rare. I can only think of like M. Night Shyamalan with The Sixth Sense. That really propelled him to popularity. It only happens once in a while that a director becomes pretty regarded and popular. Well, the opening weekend, it did great. It made back its budget and then some with a $37 million opening weekend. It was number one. Number two was G.I. Joe, The Rise of Cobra. That was in its second week. The Time Traveler's Wife was number three in its first week. Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince was number 7 at the box office, and that had been out for 5 weeks. Ponyo was number 1. That was kind of a Disney-ish sort of movie.
That's Studio Ghibli right there, too, so that's going to get a lot of money.
Yeah, that was at number 1. That came in at number 9 at the box office. So, as you can see, the competition was pretty slim.
Right.
All this other stuff had been out for a while. I do see The Hurt Locker was actually number 21 at the box office, and it had been out for about 2 months.
Wow. Yeah, so it came out at a very good time where all the big movies had already kind of made their way through for the audience.
Yes. Which is always optimal. That's what you want.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly what you want. So it just kind of, it was a perfect situation for Neill Blomkamp to have his movie released and then be recognized for all this.
Yes. Well, this is actually the biggest Blomkamp opening weekend ever. And it is the largest domestic grossing Blomkamp movie. It is the second largest foreign grossing Blomkamp movie. Elysium grossed more in the foreign market. And it's the second largest worldwide gross. Elysium, the sequel. Not the sequel. Blomkamp's follow-up film. That did gross more also. And just a fun fact, this movie was banned in Nigeria because of how it portrayed the Nigerians in this movie as these kind of cannibal criminals, I guess, just low-life thugs.
I can understand that.
So that ticked the Nigerians off. They're like, hey, don't show this movie here. Mm-hmm. From what I gathered, this movie was kind of loosely based off of District 6, which was kind of a living area in Cape Town, South Africa. Obviously, this movie is dealing with the issue of apartheid, which plagued South Africa for a long, long time.
Right.
And Cape Town, South Africa, there were 60,000 inhabitants in District 6, and they were forcibly removed to what were called the Cape Flats, which were a pretty cruddy area. That was during apartheid. And this is what this movie deals with. These aliens are in District 9, and they're being evicted to District 10. So this movie clearly does deal with kind of the outsider or the other, the different person thing, and there's pretty major apartheid similarities, and it deals with that issue, and we'll get more into that for the review.
Right, and I definitely do remember hearing about this situation back in 2009, but I guess I didn't really connect the dots, probably because I forgot about it when I watched this movie. And so I had a bit of a different view on it than maybe what you did, maybe even knowing this situation. So I'd be a cause for interesting conversation.
Yes. I have 2 dear friends from South Africa. Actually, I know some people from South Africa. And I do know about the apartheid, what's been going on. And actually, currently South Africa is in kind of turmoil with some of their elected leaders. So kind of the stuff I was seeing in the beginning of this, I'm like, well, that doesn't look too far off from what's happening today, sadly, with their political and social environment.
Right.
But before we get into the plot summary for the movie, I want to tell you, listeners, that we are going into spoiler territory. So if you haven't seen District 9 and you don't want it to be spoiled, then go ahead and hit pause right now. Go ahead and watch the movie. and then come back and hit play, it'll pick up right where you left off. But you have been warned that we are about to spoil District 9. Wikus van de Merwe, don't know if I said that right.
Quite a name.
Quite a name. Works for MNU, not the college that our friend goes to in my family and teaches at.
There's a college that we both know called Mid-American Nazarene University. And when I heard MNU, I was like, interesting, because their initials is MNU.
I did think that was funny also. Well, MNU in the movie stands for the Multinational United. Kind of sounds like a United Nations almost thing, except right. I'm pretty sure it's supposed to be kind of like a relations unit between the different races and ethnicities in South Africa. Wikus and his company are tasked with relocating, or more so evicting, a race of aliens derogatorily referred to as prawns because of their similarities resembling crustaceans. The prawn ship has been hovering over Johannesburg, South Africa for the past 27 years. The prawns are treated like scum and live in the slum of District 9, an extremely segregated ghetto with a big border wall and shanty towns. The over 1 million prawns are being relocated to District 10 in order to get them away from the humans who despise them. During the process, Wikus opens a canister that he shouldn't have, which sprays black goo all over his face. The black goo is fuel that the alien Christopher Johnson has been collecting to fuel the mothership and escape their captivity on Earth. The goo causes Wikus's metamorphosis into a prawn. Hunted by the government and ostracized by his family, Wikus must help Johnson return to the mothership so that Robinson can come back to Earth to return Wikus to his humanity and save the alien race. So, something that I was intrigued by and forgot about is this movie is very it's a documentary, essentially.
Yeah. Yes, this movie kind of flops between documentary and like a kind of a movie type of sense, but the opening few minutes of this movie was a documentary. And in fact, it kind of felt like a summary of a documentary that we were seeing. Mm-hmm. And at first I was like, oh, is this just the exposition before we hop into the real story? And it kind of is. This movie kind of muddies the water between what's documentary and what's not a documentary. And I'll talk about that a little bit later because in this first half, it's not too bad. But I think later on, it kind of gets a bit confusing. Yeah. But it is very interesting because this movie, if there's one thing that I've noticed between the two Blomkamp movies that I've seen, this one and Elysium now, it has to be Blomkamp's sense of style, which is like a dystopian future. And if there's one thing I love about any of his movies is that sense of style, which this movie is definitely going for a realistic sense, and it works pretty well, I would say. In fact, very well. And so this opening with this documentary style, it really, really works because it kind of gets you into the head of these humans and what their mindset is against this alien race that kind of just showed up 27 years ago, and now they're being moved.
It does a very good job of really setting a foundation for the rest of the movie without being like knocking you over the head or spoon feeding you with exposition.
Right.
I really didn't think of it that way. And it shows you the plight of the prawns. I honestly felt for them because this treatment is just, and it's hard to use the word inhumane because they're not human, but clearly they're highly intelligent beings that are actually more intelligent than humans because of their space technology and space travel. So they're more intelligent than humans, but they're treated like animals. And the humans, it really sets you against the humans, but it also kind of conflicts you because Wikus is just this really simple guy. Right. Wikus is just so simple and pretty likable, but he also seems kind of like this classic, arrogant white guy who seems nice, but is a racist. And we've seen this depiction in books and movies before where, they don't think they're doing anything wrong and they think they have the right to like lord their power over others. And it's just really interesting because then we see even the black population is against the prawns. And it's like, okay, you were in apartheid and treated horribly for so long. And now you're just going to turn right around and do it on these others, Right. But it's a good setup.
Yeah, it is a good setup. And I love how the aliens are introduced into the story, how they talk about how the ship just showed up one day and they have no idea where it came from. And so the humans kind of looked at it and studied it for a while, and then eventually decided to go break in, essentially. And when they broke in, they more or less saved the aliens that were there, because they were, as the movie puts it, they were extremely malnourished when the humans broke in and found them. And like they were kind of like trapped in their ship. And so if it weren't for the humans, then the aliens that came would probably have just died in their ship. And then, of course, they're moved to District 9. And then seeing it now, 27 years later, I love how this movie is so after the fact, that the aliens are already here. That's not the important part, you know. The important part is what's happening during the segregation and migrating them, the aliens, to District 10. And I found that to be super interesting, because we already have plenty of movies where the aliens come and, you know, take over the Earth or whatever. But this one is different. This is after the fact. They've already come, and they're not here to like take over the Earth. They're just, we don't even know why they're here, you know. And I thought this very, very interesting. And one of the things I picked up almost immediately was segregation. I know that here in America, back in the early to mid 90s, we had a big segregation issue after the not white folk had gotten their freedom and they were recognized by the government as full citizens. The society kind of kept them segregated. They had their own schools, they had their own places in the restaurant, they had their own Riki fountains, and usually they were just not they were not kept out very well because no one really took care of them. And so this is kind of also being shown in the movie, where you had two different signs, one for humans and then one for aliens. And I thought that was very, very interesting to see how we're treating these aliens, who are very human-like, by the way, as humans, but we're still segregating them because we think us humans are better than them, essentially.
Yes, and like you said, the United States has experienced this also. Even though the slaves were freed after the Civil War, they were always segregated. The slogan was like separate but equal. So yeah, this is not just, you know, germane to South Africa. This was also experienced in the States. And what it also made me think of was during World War II, I think this is something a lot of United States citizens forget, is that during World War II, a majority of the Japanese population, which were not Japanese, they were Americans, were forcibly evicted from their homes and moved to, I don't know, they're not concentration camps, of course, but they were just,
right,
I don't know, kind of like labor camps, or just, I don't know what the proper term is at the moment, but that was a really dark spot on American history.
I believe they were called internment camps.
Yeah, and this was before the real big civil rights movement broke out, kind of, I guess, in the 50s. There was some things going on in the 40s, but this was in the 40s. So Japanese Americans, American citizens, were evicted from their home and put in these camps which is really bad that this happened. So that's what that also made me think of, where they're kind of evicting these aliens and moving them to District 10.
Right.
I'm like, well, that's also pretty similar to what happened in the United States.
Right. And it's also interesting, too, how whenever Wikus goes up to evict the aliens, he's essentially forcing them to sign the paper, because before the scene begins, when they first enter District 9, it's mentioned that the eviction notices means that they have 24 hours to leave. And he's essentially going up to the aliens and just being like, okay, you have to sign this because it's your eviction notice, you have to leave, essentially. He's not giving them any choice.
No, they're absolutely not given any choice. And like you mentioned just a little bit earlier, I really like how this movie kind of turns the formula on its head. Whereas we've really never seen a movie like this, I would say, because we've seen tons of movies where the aliens come and humanity's afraid because the super advanced civilization is going to conquer us and destroy the world. Whereas this super advanced civilization comes, but they're sick and incapacitated, so humanity basically domineers them and, you know, just kind of enslaves them, like entraps them like that. I'm like, that's really interesting. It's not like what happened if the aliens come.
Right.
Well, you don't normally think that we would kind of, you know, control them like that. It's a pretty unique concept. And we've seen even like big name directors like Ridley Scott with Prometheus. When, you know, Wikus, this black goo, infects him, then it starts to change him. Ridley Scott borrowed that, and
Right.
when the black goo touches, he drinks the black goo on that one thing, then that starts to change him. And even with these like big ships hovering over places, we saw Denis Villeneuve kind of do something like that with Arrival, where they have to go in there. We've seen it with Signs. So I guess some of that is not totally original, but it is interesting that some of that has been kind of cribbed after District 9 and still used.
Right. And one other thing I can kind of compare this movie to as well is this is Neill Blomkamp's Reservoir Dogs, where it's very much after the fact, but it's the after the fact that's the most interesting part of this movie. Because in Reservoir Dogs, for those who haven't seen it, the story is centered around a robbery of a jewelry store that goes wrong, but you never really see the robbery. You see everything either before or after the fact that it happened. And that's what the movie is centered around. If you haven't seen it, I very much recommend it. It's very, very interesting. I think this movie is pretty similar to that in the vein of it's so after the fact. What happened before is not the most important part of what the movie's trying to say. What's happening now with the aliens being migrated to District 10 and being evicted, that's the important part. That's what the movie's trying to talk about.
I do want to kind of give kudos to the technical side. I think the CGI, for the most part, looks great, especially for 2009. There are some stinkers in here where the CGI clearly looks very dated or very unrealistic.
Yeah, for 2009 it looks very, very good. Like the ship always in the distance when you're outside. Sometimes the aliens, they look pretty good, but I think the aliens are probably the weakest link for this movie, where they have really good emotion. And there's one key scene that really shows that. And we'll talk about when we get there. But yeah, I think you're right. Some of the CGI in this is pretty dated.
Some shots of the aliens are incredible, I would say. But some are, okay. I would probably say the worst part of the CGI is the mech suit.
Yeah.
When we first see that, it looks incredibly fake. And towards the end, some shots do look fairly well done, whereas others are like, eh. It was Peter Jackson had worked with Weta Digital, which has done Avatar and The Lord of the Rings, and it's done amazing work. They approached Weta Digital to do this, but they were busy with Avatar, so they got some other like Canadian-run company to do CGI.
Right, and it's kind of interesting too because Avatar came out this same year, if I'm not mistaken.
The Blu-ray copy looks great. So if you're going to watch this movie, I recommend picking up the Blu-ray copy because that'll probably give you the best picture quality and sound for the whole thing. But as I was saying, this movie can be pretty brutal with some of the concepts that it deals with. We're already dealing with apartheid in a new way, kind of, but it's still very familiar and similar. But then we also see these prawns and aliens are so highly like regulated. They're like, this is illegal, that's illegal, they need a permit for that, and there's like a limit on how many children they can have, if any. And we see Wikus perform he calls it an abortion on a prawn egg, and they're laughing about it, they're having a good time. He's like, oh, it's no big deal. Right. He's like, they can't be doing this. So the humans are involved in like eugenics in a way, and population control. So there's some pretty dark themes, and it really sets us against the humans. I'm like, okay, these humans are bad people. So I'm on the side of the aliens right now.
Oh yeah, definitely. And at one point in the movie, I said that it's not the aliens who are the aliens in the story. It's the humans. The humans are the aliens in the story.
Good point.
And I think I'll get to that when we get there in the story, and I'll explain what I was thinking. But yeah, you're totally right. This opening scene with Wikus and his crew kind of going in and evicting all the aliens and everything. It's very cruel. And Wikus, as a character, he's doing his job, but he's acting like he likes doing his job, which I'm sure he does, which is the scariest part because the aliens are very heavily monitored, and there are many times where the movie cuts to like a camera where it's monitoring it. And at one point when we meet Christopher, I believe is his name, who has the kid where Wikus helps escape, he asked him, do you have a permit for that child? And it's very clear that this District 9 is very heavily regulated, and it's to a point where it's just unfair because it's hard for the aliens to survive because they're just so regulated, and that's why it's so slummy and really gross and everything in District 9.
Well, and yeah, earlier I used the word ghetto because this isn't too, dissimilar from the treatment of the Jews by the Nazis in a way. They rounded them up, they put them in ghettos, give them the worst conditions. They can just be murdered on demand. These population controls, license for this and that, abortions. It's pretty bad. So it's a pretty bad situation.
Yeah.
So they're clearly drawing on real life situations. But also, I think this is a fantastic instance of world building. Just great world building.
Oh, yeah. If there's one thing that has never been seen before, it's this. This movie is very Mad Max-esque. If you've seen the original Mad Max, at this time, Fury Road hadn't been released. That won't be released for another few years. But we did have the Mad Max trilogy back from early 70s and 80s. And this is very Mad Max-esque. I kind of compared it to a little bit of Blade Runner in it, where we have all that more futuristic technology, whereas Mad Max is very much set in the desert. So yeah, it's very interesting seeing both of those styles, Blade Runner and Mad Max, kind of come together, and with aliens. It's a very, very interesting style, and I love how this movie looks. I think that one criticism I have is I kind of wanted a bit more from the movie to show me its world, because it looks very, very interesting, but I kind of wanted to see more and get into it more. The District 9 doesn't really feel as much as a character as I think it should have, but that also doesn't mean that it's not really good looking, because this movie looks great.
I do think they did a great job of building District 9, though, because they spend quite a bit of time in the beginning, like moving through it, and then towards the end, like chasing and running through it. It does feel like a legitimate place in, right outside Johannesburg. And yeah, I do think that they really bring you into that world really well. So I don't think I really had any issues with it. I was incredibly impressed with it. And these different types of biological weapons that only can interact with the biology of the aliens is really cool. It's a really, I think it's an incredible blend of like real life and science fiction. And I think that's why it set Neill Blomkamp on the map after this, because then everybody was like, okay, what's this guy going to come up with next?
Right. And that's one of the things I love too, is that it's actually a collaboration of just like the present time and then futuristic-ish technology that isn't made by humans. The aliens come with their technology, and it's very futuristic, but everything that the humans use is very modern. And it's kind of interesting to see that kind of dynamic just between the two in this movie.
Yeah, and I really do like this film also has a moral to it that, we kind of see pride goes before the fall. Don't despise other people because they're different than you, or they look different, or they're from a different place. You would think that would be kind of a basic lesson, but sadly it's not to a lot of people. But I really do think the movie does a really good job of teaching these moral lessons. Because these humans are so cocky. They do not understand these aliens really at all, but they think they do. And then it comes back to bite them. And Wikus really gets his life turned upside down. And then now he lives in the perspective of one of the prawns. And his world is over just like theirs is. And he learns to Christopher Robin. He was a Christopher Johnson, not Christopher Robin from Winnie the Pooh. Christopher Johnson, which I thought that was really weird. They gave all the aliens human names, I'm pretty sure. That's the only thing that makes sense. I'm like, that's a human name. I guess they just gave them all names to make everything easier. But it really does come back to bite them, and pride before the fall, and it really does have a lot of good moral lessons in it that are not preachy.
Now, I do kind of want to talk about the situation with the aliens real quick, because about halfway through this opening act, I caught something that I thought was really interesting. And in this opening act, I said that maybe nobody is in the right in this situation, because we have Wikus coming in and he's having to evict all of these aliens. And the reason for that is for population control and things like that. But at the same time, the aliens are also creating weapons, and they have weapons that only work with the aliens, and a human cannot operate it. And so humans are also kind of scared that that's going to come back and bite them, so they decide to move on and confiscate those weapons because they consider those to be illegal. And it's very clear that these aliens are very dangerous if provoked, because earlier in the scene when when they're evicting people or evicting the aliens. One of the aliens we see, actually a few of them, we see them get mad, and one of them kicks a guy or rips his arm off, and they like fly through buildings and things like that. So it's very clear that these aliens can be very dangerous if provoked, but at the same time, the humans are very immoral with their actions by moving them elsewhere and trying to control them, essentially, even though they're not causing too much harm being in District 9. So it's kind of interesting. I mean, it makes a lot more sense that the aliens are the way they are. They're trying to build these weapons, maybe to even protect themselves for in the future or something like that. But it kind of has this gray area where it's like, okay, well, who really is right in this situation,
right.
you know?
I saw that same thing too, because at one point they set you against the humans and you're for the prawns. But then you see the prawns get brutally violent. It's not like, oh, the human got shot, they were just going to remove the bullet or he's okay. No, they're ripping limbs off, and the weapons they use just totally rip people apart and destroy them. So this movie is hard R with its language and brutal graphic violence. I was like, holy cow, these people are just blowing up.
You see a lot of humans explode in this movie, just kind of vaporize. It's crazy.
So yeah, I do agree, because at one point you're like, oh, these poor prawns, but then you see them just, ripping these humans from limb to limb, and it's like, okay, that's not okay. That's not an okay response.
Yeah.
So yeah, there is this really gray area.
So it makes sense from both sides to act the way they do, but yeah.
I like how Wikus is the bridge. He's the bridging perspective, because we see the uppity, racist humans, and then we see the lowly prawns that are really just trying to do their best and figure out how to make their way in this situation. And then we see Wikus bridge that gap, because we see his metamorphosis from the uppity supremacy human to a lowly, despised, hunted prawn, and it's a really cool journey. And evolution or de-evolution?
Yeah, we do get to see Wikus kind of experience what he's been doing, because he's slowly turning into an alien, and so the first thing that the government does is they want to test him, and they get him to test these alien weapons. And I love this scene where they're forcing him to test these weapons, and the whole time he's screaming for his wife, and that he wants to just get out of there. And at first it's nothing big. They're just kind of blowing up random objects to test that the weapon works. And then it starts going a bit too far when they start holding up, like, I think alien limbs or stuff like that. And then they pull in like a live alien from District 9, and they put him up there, and he's like, no, I'm not going to do this. And then he's forced to do it. And it's very clear that his mindset on this entire issue is what needs to change for him, because he's slowly turning into one of the aliens. And it's very, very interesting to see his character change. There's a drastic, unmistakable change of his character from beginning to end.
Yeah, there really is. So I'd say there's a great character arc.
Oh yeah, there is a great character arc here.
And this further shows how brutal these humans are, and how they just don't have any value for life. They're just really power hungry, and possibly even war hungry, it seems like. Because I'm shocked. I'm like, okay, Wikus is a South African citizen, with some prominent family members, even though his father-in-law totally throws him under the bus. He just becomes a lab guinea pig used for experiments. And when he doesn't comply, they use an electric cattle prod on him. I'm like, this is clear human rights violations. But that shows you, because of his prawn hand, he is now treated the exact same way. They're like, okay, you're not really totally human anymore, so you don't have any more rights. Which is crazy. I'm like, oh my gosh.
Yeah, and as I was saying earlier when I said that the humans are the aliens in this situation, this is kind of what I meant, is that usually back in the 70s or the early 2000s, when we had all these videos come out of UFOs and things like that, and there was a stigma that if you got abducted, they would split you open and dissect you and things like that. This is what I mean. This is very much a commentary on that, is that we're the ones doing what we were afraid of that aliens would do. And so I thought that was very interesting how the tide is so different. It's very much turned on its head, where we're the ones who are dissecting these aliens and figuring out what exactly they're made of and how they work and things like that. And it makes a lot of sense because that's what we'd probably do if we were put in this situation.
That's a really good point that I hadn't thought of. There is that, like, dissection scene or whatever where the humans abducted, and then it's just like, oh no, they did experiments on me. And it's like, oh wow, yeah, I guess that would make sense, because then the humans are like, we're going to do all these experiments on an alien, even if it is inhumane, and where does that line blur? And apparently it's with Wikus.
Right.
If he's just got a prawn hand, if he's, transmutation, then they do it. So it's really neat how the movie kind of flips that on its head.
And then it's also interesting too, because then the news and the government turns everyone against Wikus, because they start like putting out all these lies on the news and things like that of him being framed for sexual acts with the aliens and things like that. People are starting to make fun of him, and his humanity is just devalued to just nothing, basically. He's treated, I would even say, less than the aliens are, because the government wants him to be tested on. And it's very interesting.
There's like two brief kind of like technical issues I just want to discuss real quick. It's the use of the camera work and the style of the movie, and also just briefly subtitles. But the first thing that I want to mention real quick that I kind of have an issue with is this movie is supposed to be documentary style. Lots of interviews with experts and family members, and the one expert that they cut to a lot, he actually did the whatever they call it for Christopher Johnson, the mocap work or whatever it's called. So he was Christopher Johnson, which is pretty cool. That main guy, I can't remember his name, but he's like the first one we see on the screen. Well, that's really conflicting, because this isn't like a total found footage movie like 10 Cloverfield Lane or a full documentary.
Right.
So, but then sometimes the footage presented in the movie, it's supposed to kind of model the documentary style, but it's not like somebody with the camera is running after him. So that's very conflicting camera work and types of methods, blending two different styles in a way that if you're not really paying attention, it works. But if you are, then you're like, well, this is pretty confusing, because we're bouncing back and forth between actual documentary footage that was being filmed and then not being filmed by anybody. So it kind of takes you out of it a little bit.
Yeah.
Because then you have to suspend reality. You're like, wait, who's filming this right now? Oh, wait, nobody is. It just is, I guess. I don't know.
That's kind of what I meant when I said earlier that it kind of flips between the documentary and like a regular movie. That was kind of what I meant. So we're on the same page on that one. I feel very much the exact same way. Is that this movie, I think it does a pretty good job at leading in from the documentary part to just the regular movie part. But at the same time, it doesn't dismiss the fact that it is kind of jarring that this flips back between those two.
I thought the subtitles were interesting because we had subtitles for the aliens, which made sense. Some of the, I guess, Nigerians with really thick accents had subtitles. But then there was also times when we had subtitles where I felt like we didn't need subtitles. So I think because I'm like, wait, they're speaking in English, I can discern it. I really feel like it's not that hard to discern, but they're giving us subtitles nonetheless. So the uses of subtitles I felt was inconsistent, and it took me out of the movie. Because I'm just sitting here, I'm like, why are they giving us subtitles? I know what they're saying.
My situation was actually kind of interesting, because I watched District 9 off of your Plex server, and there were actually no subtitles.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, even after I turned them on. But I don't think it hindered my movie experience very much anyways, because you didn't get subtitles with the aliens, but it felt realistic that way. Because you were having a conversation, whenever the aliens were talking, they were having a conversation with a human, and then the human would just kind of talk back, and you were able to essentially discern what they were saying. Or the one scene that I was talking about, that I mentioned earlier that I wanted to talk about, when Christopher and his son are talking, and you get this really emotional moment, because he has this pamphlet for M&U and what exactly is happening and where they're moving him to, and then they have like this moment where they're both just really sad, and the son just does not want to go, and the father's like, I wish I could say you didn't have to, And not all that is said without any words, and it's just the mocap for the aliens. This is kind of where the CGI really shows that it's really well done, is that you really get some good emotion out of these aliens. And luckily Wikus kind of came in and explained what exactly was going on. But for me, I would almost suggest not watching it with subtitles because it kind of makes you pay attention a bit more. Because the humans, when they're talking to somebody with the humans, they more or less show what they were talking about, which kind of almost removes the fact for the subtitles. But it does, I think it would help with the subtitles on to kind of show what the aliens are saying because I had no idea. Luckily, the script was written in such a way where you didn't really need them. So that was my thing, is that even though there weren't subtitles, I was still kind of able to discern what was going on in the scene.
That's a really unique perspective because if you saw it in the theater and if you saw it like I did, then there were subtitles for all of that. There were subtitles for everything the aliens were saying to each other. So, yeah, I'd probably recommend maybe watch it with subtitles first and then go back and watch it without subtitles so you can focus more on their interactions. Or maybe just don't watch it with those subtitles because that's actually a really cool perspective where you're focused more on, you know, their interactions and their feelings. And you kind of can understand their plight because you feel kind of desperate like they do. You're just kind of a stranger in a strange land like that. So that's pretty cool. You got that perspective with that. That's neat. I think we also should talk about this movie can be funny too.
Yeah.
I think there is some funny, like unintentionally funny stuff, and it normally always revolves around Wikus because he's just this really doofy kind of guy. Like when he says to the little prawn kid, he's like, "You want a sweetie? You want a sweetie?" And then he like throws it over there, and then the kid like chucks it back at his head.
Yeah.
And when Wikus gets upset, just things like that. Or Wikus comes home for the surprise party, and he's like, "I need to get to the toilet quickly. I think I might have crapped in my pants."
Right.
There's just some dialogue which I think is just so funny like that.
Right. The opening too is kind of like you said when he throws something at the kid and the kid just throws it right back. That's kind of like world building right there, where you see Wikus interacting with these aliens and then they just kind of retaliate just because they're just used to that. They've been there for over 20 years, over 2 decades, and yeah, there's also that one scene when he's talking to one of the aliens and trying to evict him, and the alien just slaps his clipboard down, and then the guards kind of go after him. He's like, it's okay. Slapping the clipboard, that means he signed it, you know? And they move on. So, yeah, you're right. This movie can be very funny. Almost like unethical humor, just because of how things are being treated. But the aliens just kind of revolt back to him, too, as well. Yeah,
that's true. Yeah, they're like, oh, this is what that means. They want cat food. Or, like, Wikus will get, like, punched by an alien and go flying back into a urinal or something like that. It's just a rough day for him, but it's a little funny, the interactions in that way.
Yeah.
But also, I thought it was weird when Wikus is clearly really sick, but they're like, no, the party must go on, Wikus. We got all these people here. I don't care if you're throwing up. You're going to have a good time. Until it ends with him, like, just spewing up black goo everywhere and like passing out, and they're like, guess we better take him to the hospital now. But he's clearly sick.
Like, I guess.
I know, and he's just like, okay, I'll put on a potty hat and try my best.
Right, yeah. I wonder, this movie does kind of paint humanity in a very bad light, because that scene where they're kind of disregarding of what's really happening with Wikus, and then his wife's father kind of throws him under the bus a bit later with these few scenes, and yeah, there's definitely a devaluement of kind of life in general in this movie.
That's very true. After we learn that Wikus is kind of like beyond the point of coming back, we see his wife crying about it, and I felt her crying, I made a note, her crying is really bad and fake.
Which scene is this? I know there's 2 of them. Is this the first one you're talking about?
Is that the one where her dad is talking to her? They're like, oh, there's nothing they could do about the infection. And she's like, Dad, I thought he was fine. I want Wikus back.
Well, that scene too, but there's one scene where Wikus steals a guy's cell phone and then calls his wife, and she essentially says that they're going to come after you and that she doesn't want him back or whatever.
Yeah.
And then there's a second scene when they're having a conversation, and he's like, I'm going to figure it out. I'm going to come back. Everything's going to return back to normal. So I know there's a couple of scenes with the wife crying. I did think that the second conversation was a bit better than the first one. Because I got to see it more from Wikus's perspective, and I got more out of what he was doing. But I think I can see what you mean when the crime was kind of fake.
Yeah, this was when, I'm pretty sure it was when she was talking with just her dad about it.
Okay.
I was like, eh. Well, this is also a pretty good, like a really long Twilight Zone episode.
Yeah, you're right. That's interesting, yeah.
And I do want to, like, commend the guy who played Wikus again. I feel like he was really believable in his role. And we see his plight and pain, and it's pretty sad, like, what happens to him. And he does a good job as, like, a simple guy, but then just, like, everything he's going through. I was incredibly impressed with his acting. And I think it's a shame he was not nominated for Best Actor.
Yeah, I'm kind of surprised that he wasn't either. I could definitely see him being nominated for this role. Now, there is also something interesting I also kind of wanted to touch on, and that's how focused this movie is as well. Because this movie primarily focuses only on Wikus, but we also have Christopher and his son that need to get back to the ship as well. But primarily it's focused on just Wikus and his situation that he has to go through, that he has to face himself. And then we get that relationship when Christopher comes in the picture and they start talking and things like that. I thought that was really interesting, and that was what made the movie so much better for me, is that it was very simple when it came to that kind of a thing, where it was a drive for him to get from one place to another, versus a lot of other movies that are produced by Hollywood. There's a very big picture, very epic kind of a feel to it, and you have a lot of different characters that are so important to the story. Whereas this one is just two. You essentially just two characters that both have a drive to get places. And Wikus wants to change himself back to a human, and Christopher wants to get back to the ship and escape. So I thought that was very interesting and very, very nice to have, instead of having everything, as the movie's just really, really bloated and having so many characters, that this movie just kind of focuses and phones it in on just a couple and the relationship between them, and how Wikus is forced to change in order for everything to work.
Yeah, it's a really good character study, I would say.
Yeah,
and I do appreciate how they're able to maintain that focus throughout the film. And it's a nearly 2-hour film.
Yeah.
And I think one of those powerful moments that really drives that home is when they're in their kind of underground bunker thing, which we don't know yet is the ship. And the little Christopher Johnson's son is like holding his little his arm up to Wikus's, and he like looks back and forth between them, and he's like, we're the same, and you wouldn't have gotten those subtitles where it kind of like says something like that, but you could tell when he's like holding it up. I thought that was a really powerful moment.
Right. Yeah. And that's also kind of going back to the scene I was talking about earlier, when Christopher is talking with his son, and they have that short conversation where he's like, this is where we're going to go, or whatever. I'm not entirely sure what the subtitles were, but he's showing them this is where we're going, or where they want us to go. And his son just kind of pushes it away and says, I don't want to go there. I want to stay here.
Yeah. And
like I said, I'm not going to explain it again, but that it's just a really, really interesting and heartfelt scene from Computer Creations.
It really is, yeah. Something I want to talk about with the writing, I feel the writing is overall very well done. I think there's 1 or 2 times where the writing's a little stupid.
Yeah.
Or they're like, tell me you've got a fix on him. And they're like, yeah, he's in District 9. That's a huge area. Where? And also, I personally felt the usage of the F word got to be too excessive. It was just ridiculous at a certain point where it was just like, okay, I don't know.
Yeah.
That just seemed too excessive.
Right. And for me, getting to the climax, everything up to the climax was fine. But then when we started hitting the climax, I felt like things started getting kind of cheesy. And lines were kind of being spewed for line's sake, I guess. One of the big examples of this is like the guy who wants to kill Wikus. I don't exactly know his name, but he felt at times really, really cheesy. And there is even a moment, because his character is pretty shallow. He's not in the movie up until this point, really. And there's a moment
throughout.
Yeah, but he's like, this is like his primary moment.
Right.
And there was one character that looked exactly like him. And there was one scene when they were like literally side by side and they looked the exact same and I couldn't tell them apart. And I was just like, who was talking? Because they looked so similar. But yeah, this guy, he's really, really can be very cheesy. And parts of me were just like, I wish this wasn't in the film because we had done so good with writing up until this point. I feel like the movie was, and I get it, this movie is just kind of going for just, and now it's just having a lot of fun. And there's nothing wrong with that, but at the same time, I wish we kind of would have kept up that writing where it wasn't so cheesy and was kind of pulling me out. This is one of my bigger issues with it.
Sure. That was kind of a weird area. We're focusing on Wikus and the prawns, but also the relationship with the government. But then there also is kind of this side subplot with the kind of Nigerian criminals that live in District 9.
Yeah.
These gangsters, and they're kind of alluded to in the beginning. It was kind of a funny scene where he's like, that is the gangster. Don't look at him. Just don't look. Keep walking. Keep walking. I'm like, yeah, that's kind of real life with certain things. Like, don't look. Just keep walking.
Right.
Yeah, and he wants to eat the hands, and he thinks if they eat it, it'll give him special powers. Not really sure that is very necessary to the movie. It just seems kind of erroneous, a little excessive. Some of that fat could have been trimmed from the storyline instead of kind of putting it in as much as it is. So I see what you mean.
I understand the point of the Nigerians being in the story, but I think they took it a step too far with them eating the aliens and things like that. But at the same time, if it were anybody but the Nigerians, I feel like that would have made a bit more sense that there's this kind of cultist group that think that they can become one with the aliens or something like that if they ingest them. In that sense, it makes a lot more sense. But having the name of Nigerians on them, I can see why they blocked this movie in that country.
Yeah. Something else I felt was during some of these action scenes, because we're drawing closer to the climax, which is pretty long, actually.
Yeah.
I would say the climax goes from when they break into M&U to get that vial to pretty much the end.
Yeah.
And that's like half an hour long.
It's a long ending scene, and I mean, if you're watching it just for like an action, like just to have fun, it is a lot of fun. But I know for me personally, it got to the point where I was just like, okay, we just keep moving, move on with the story.
Well, okay, I didn't have a problem when they broke into M&U. I thought that was actually really good and pretty cool how they were taking the fight to them. But I was fine with that, and my heart was pounding a little bit when they're being chased out of M&U. I'm like, oh my gosh, what's going to happen? And then we learn that Christopher Johnson's not going to come back for 3 years, which is pretty shocking.
Yeah.
And then this is where we get the ending fight. And honestly, there's that General Corbus or Globus or whatever his name is. I felt he was pretty one-dimensional and generic.
Yeah.
And granted, I was very tired the day I watched it. It had been a very long day at school and work. So I dozed a little bit, kind of in the beginning of this really long climactic fight scene. So I was dozing, but I really feel like I didn't miss too much. But the problem with dozing during like fight scenes, especially like long climaxes, is it feels like they're extra long because you like lose all sense of time. So you're just like, oh my gosh, how long have I been asleep? And you wake up, you're like, oh man, it's still going on.
Right.
But anyway, regardless, I thought it was cool how the little kid was controlling that mech suit to fight, and then Wikus got into it. And it just shows you but it also shows you, because he's willing to sacrifice himself, that it's not like, hey, I want you to save me. He's like, okay, go back. I don't get to go in the ship with you. Go back. I'm going to stay here and pretty much fight to the death. And it's shocking that he doesn't die, honestly. I'm going to fight to the death so you can go back and then come back and save. So really cool character arc. But this action scene is just way too long.
It really is. And I think one of my bigger issues with this climax too is that there's a lot of tonal shifts in this movie. And I think that kind of hindered my enjoyment of this ending, is that there were times where it's like really, really action packed and things are going great. And then all of a sudden it kind of just stops and slows down into like this emotional moment. And then picks back up again and keeps going again. And this happens like 3 or 4 times in this climax. Like if it was just one or two times, I would understand that. But like 3 times. I feel like that's like pushing it a bit too far to really, that kind of segments the climax for me. And I do agree with you. This ending action scene kind of goes on a longer than it probably should have. It's enjoyable, but I feel like it could have chopped off a few minutes that make it flow a bit better. And that's one thing I also kind of wanted to mention earlier, is that the pacing of this movie is actually really, really good.
Yeah.
Because I didn't feel like it was almost a 2-hour movie. I feel like it was maybe like 45-ish minutes, just because this movie's paced so quick and does a really good job of moving along. But yeah, this ending action scene, it could have been cut down, I think. It's a bit much. And I started getting kind of a little bit overwhelmed about this point, because there is a lot of action happening on the screen, and I was just kind of wanted to slow down for a little bit. And then when it did slow down, it felt really awkward, and yeah.
Sure, I 100% agree with that. And honestly, just the year before Rambo came out, listeners, go back and listen to our podcast. It's just called Rambo from 2008. This felt almost a little bit like that, where all it is just, shooting big guns and blowing up bodies. So, and I noticed, I read some of Roger Ebert's review for this movie when it came out, and he said the movie was like really unique throughout the whole thing, but the climax was pretty much devolved into a generic shoot 'em up action movie. Yeah. Whereas that's really not what this movie is about. This movie's really not an action movie, but then at the end, it's just, blowing everybody up and lots of gunfire and shooting, and it just goes on too long. And like you said, it does change the tone of the movie. Right. The one thing I did think was, 2 things I thought were cool. When that car charges Wikus in the mech suit, and he just like picks it up and flips it, and he kind of goes down with it too. I'm like, that was awesome.
That was really cool. I wrote that down in my notes. I was like, that's pretty sick.
Yeah, and the CGI looked really good too.
Yeah, it did.
Also, when Globus has the rocket launcher and he's going to shoot the ship that's coming up out of there. And okay, but before I mention that, I was shocked when the ship got shot down. I'm like, holy cow, how are they going to get back? I was like, maybe this movie is not a happy ending, and they don't. But it's cool. There's like this tractor beam that pulled them up, and it's like slowly pulling them up. Globus shoots that missile, and Wikus just catches it like that.
Yeah,
like, that's really cool.
Yeah, there are, and I'll say this too: as long as this action scene it's not that it's not enjoyable. It's really good action. It's not like boring action. It's really good stuff. Like we have especially small bits in here that you just mentioned, with them catching the rocket or flipping that car over. It's super cool stuff at times. And yeah, I totally agree. This movie there are a few things in this climax that are super cool.
And after it's over, we see Wikus out of the suit, and we see his eye and the rest of his body. I'm like, whoa, it's really well done with the makeup, but that eye is just so creepy, that transformation. Right. And I really was like, okay, Wikus is going to die. He's not going to get out of it, but then the rest of the prawns attack. So it's a bit of a Deus Ex Machina moment. I think I'm using that term correctly.
Yeah, I can see. I think I understand why it's here, though. Is that Wikus essentially helped Christopher and his son make it to the ship, and he protected them. Like, he fought for them, and like was willing to give up his life just so they could escape. And so then that kind of makes sense at least from what I see, when the rest of the aliens attack the guy and just rip him to shreds, basically. And so it makes a lot of sense, I think. It kind of a Deus Ex Machina. I can see why people would think that. But in my mind, it made a lot of sense because Wikus is becoming one of them at this moment in time. And now that he's helped him out, they've essentially accepted him for who he is and protected him as well. Kind of goes to show that the aliens are not made of stone, essentially.
Yeah, no, I 100% agree with that. Yeah. And it does make sense why that would happen. But the only thing is I was like, okay, it seemed nearly impossible that Wikus would live. But since all the other people are taking out except kind of the big bad Globus or whatever guy. Yeah. And then he was ripped to shreds, which is kind of cliche, though, because we've seen that in a lot of movies where the bad guy at the end is like, wait, no, and then they all attack him and rip him to shreds.
Yeah, Yeah, and you're right. And I think Roger Ebert was pretty correct in this when he said that this movie kind of turns into a generic action movie. It kind of does. But yeah, it's kind of satisfying, but it would be more satisfying if he was incorporated into the story more, because there are two villains in this movie, and that's Wikus himself and then this guy who kind of replaces that towards the end. So yeah, I think it would have worked better if he was incorporated deeper into the story.
Yeah, you're right. And the movie kind of does have a very interesting ending where it's told like a true story, where they're like, currently District 10 houses 2.5 million prawns, so it's massively grown, and it's just a massive thing.
Right.
Currently, this is what happened. Wikus is supposedly dead, and just like that's the exact style of a true story type of movie, where they always give you updates of the characters or situations at the end.
Right. It's very much like Unbreakable from Shyamalan.
I haven't seen it yet.
I would recommend it. It's a good one.
Interesting. So, but it is given on a note of hope. The wife, it's not like Wikus is dead to her totally because of the flower. And I really love the ending shot where we see the prawn making a flower, and that is Wikus. That has to be Wikus. They're not officially saying if it's him, but they're pretty much alluding to that. I'm like, that's pretty cool.
Yeah, I do love this ending, this last shot too. I think it ended just right with this alien making the metal flower for his wife that we saw just a scene earlier and things like that. And yeah, it's kind of heartfelt, this ending, where even though Wikus is an alien now, he still has, those feelings and stuff.
Yes, he does. So, before we give our rating and recommendation, I just wanted to briefly mention that there is still a possibility there could be a sequel to District 9. Pretty much as soon as it was released, Neill Blomkamp said, if the movie does well, I'd like to make a sequel. Then he grew in popularity, and he's like, I've got another idea that will be outside of that universe. Clearly, a couple years later, we got Elysium, and then we got Chappie after that. So it's been like 7 years pretty much since District 9 came out. We still haven't got a sequel. There's also a possibility that he would make a prequel. He said that in 2010. In 2013, he's like, I really, really do want to do a sequel to District 9, but I've got so many different ideas in my head that I just am so busy with just coming up with brand new ideas that I don't have time to do that, is basically what he said. So he does, as of right now, he does say he still wants to do District 10, so it's a possibility that could happen, and it's maybe even more of a possibility now that his plans for an Alien sequel have fallen through, supposedly. We'll talk about more of that in a later podcast. But yeah, so it's possible, listeners, that we could be doing District 10, and honestly, I would love to see District 10.
Yeah, I would too. I would kind of want to see where he's going to take this, because this is an interesting story. And so, I'm kind of interested to see if he were to come back to that eventually. I'm sure he would. I'm really interested to see where he would take it next.
So, Alan, what is your rating and recommendation and your final thoughts for District 9?
District 9 is very interesting. And I mean that in a very good way, too, because it's very original in its ideas that it's presenting. And it's also a very interesting commentary on how, I would say, not only how humans react to different things, but at the same time, the ethics of that situation that they're put into. I mentioned earlier that the aliens in District 9 are very human-like, and I think that that's very much on purpose. I know that usually when we make aliens, we make them more human-like because that's what we're just used to. There's a whole thing in artwork where artwork comes from something else. There's never really a truly original idea. There's always something that is influenced that. And I think that that's very much true for this, but at the same time, it's very much on purpose because the aliens look a lot like humans. And that makes it a very interesting story. And I wrote in my notes that it's kind of like the conflict and representation of how the upper middle class / the 1% view those that are in the classes under them, and how the aliens are put into slums and everything like that. But everybody else, like the government officials, are living in the suburbs and in a very much better environment. So it's interesting. It's also got some really interesting lessons, small lessons like bullying or government control. And I even wrote down it reminded me of the native Indian reservations that began happening, and when we were pushed out the native residents when we had the Louisiana Purchase.
Oh yeah, that's a really good point.
Yeah, and like Manifest Destiny and things like that. It's a little bit different in this one because we've already taken it over and we just allowed them to be there, but now we kind of want to move them out. But I think that's worth mentioning is with that Louisiana Purchase and how we ended up moving those in the natives that were in the area and moved them out, and now we have reservations for them, but at the same time...
Well, and we even pushed them out of those, but now they're finally settled into these. But yeah, they've always never been given a fair shake with anything.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly what I mean, too. So, yeah, it's I think we also does a really good job at differentiating between the aliens and the humans, but then finding that gap and filling it in with the gray stuff, which is Wikus himself. And like I mentioned earlier, the technology, how the humans are very much in the present time, whereas the aliens have their own technology for their time, and it's shown off very, very, I think, very well. Not in a way that like. I know we keep bringing this movie up, but Ghost in the Shell, how that kind of shows off everything that it has, but this movie doesn't really do that because it feels so authentic that they would have that kind of stuff. And a few criticisms that I have is that I wish we could have explored the world a bit more. I know that it's very centered in its characters and it's meant to be that way, but I wish we kind of moved on and did a few more things in different places to kind of give a better sense of District 9 and its location. It's very visually interesting and realistic, and I praise it for that because there's no other movie at the time this came out that was like it, other than maybe, like I said, Mad Max, or I can see some of Blade Runner in there. I also found some of the editing to be kind of choppy at times when they were trying to move really, really quick on a thing, and then they kind of chopped it up, and it felt kind of awkward. And of course, then there were cheesy scenes that I mentioned earlier that also kind of pulled me out of the story. But overall, it's really enjoyable. District 9 is great, and for me personally, I think I'll give it an 8 out of 10, and it's a pretty solid recommend. It's a movie it's one of those movies that you can really think about and kind of get yourself into the story and learn something from it, or you can just watch it just to have some fun and watch a movie about a really interesting situation. It's one of those that does a really good job at kind of having both of those that you can do. So yeah, it's a solid recommend, 8 out of 10.
District 9, I was pleasantly surprised with District 9 because the story and world is so well crafted, and the kind of the moral of the story is really well done without hitting you over the head or spoon feeding it to you. I was incredibly impressed with the acting, and the pace was very well done, and overall I just really enjoyed District 9. Strong directorial debut for Neill Blomkamp, and writing as well. My issues were some of the stylistic choices, some of the editing choices, the climax also. There really isn't a whole lot of issues with this movie, but also I do think, and maybe they could do this more in a sequel, kind of explore the world a little more like you were saying. I do think for what we're given, it's under 2 hours. I do think that exploration is pretty well done for under 2 hours. But the climax, took up nearly half an hour of that runtime. Yeah. So that really kind of changed the tone from an exploratory kind of drama on social issues and the individual and character and the other, kind of changed the tone into kind of a full-on action film. So those are pretty much my issues with it. But overall, it's a really solid movie. So it's a solid recommend. And I'm also giving it an 8 out of 10. I think that's right where that rating, right where it deserves. And it's funny because that's what IMDb gives it. And I gave it an 8 before I knew that about IMDb. I don't think this movie could ever go higher than an 8. Just because, it's lacking some of those deeper connections, I think, where we're really close to those connections, but we kind of lose sight of them at some points. But it's definitely 8. It is a strong beginning for the Neill Blomkamp retrospective series. I'm really eager to see what Neill Blomkamp has to do in the next couple of years. Speaking from the District 9, like in 2009, this definitely put him on the map. Makes me excited to see what his other films has to offer, what kind of world building he does with those. And he's still working, so I'm really excited to see what he has. He's got a project that comes out. Well, actually, I think the movie comes out next year.
Oh, wow.
It's called Raqqa or something like that, and it's based off a short film that I did see, which was awesome.
Yeah, I heard that one was really, really good. I've been meaning to watch it.
Yes, and we will touch more on that probably in the final installment of the retrospective series before we come back and review his new film for next year. But thank you so much, listeners, for joining us embarking with us, I should say, on our first installment of our Neill Blomkamp retrospective series. I think he deserves a little more credit than he gets. He was a big name, and I think he's kind of his name's been kind of tarnished a little bit. We'll talk about that, though, with the next ones. But I do think his creativity, it deserves to be recognized in a Hollywood of a lot of cliches and blow-em-up action movies. This movie was very impressive.
Yeah, and it's kind of interesting, too, because this movie is not just a meaningless film. It actually has something behind it. In my notes, I said this is good Hollywood right here. And I think that that's a really good way of, if I were to explain this movie in a sentence, it would be good Hollywood. And I'm very impressed. I think what this movie would be interesting, too, is that they did an epic on this movie of, made the movie 4 hours long, just following Wikus, and we could explore the world a bit more,
I do think that would be interesting.
Yeah.
I think it couldn't take place over that 3-day period, though, because the movie made it pretty clear that this whole movie takes place a little over 72 hours.
Yeah.
I think we would need to follow Wikus's journey. Yeah, when he's fully realized as a prawn at the end, but then when Christopher Johnson comes back, and then that could be more of a story.
Yeah.
Yeah,
exactly.
I could definitely follow that as an epic, probably. But what we're given right now, I think it's kind of really nice as a self-contained story, just as it is.
Yeah, definitely.
Listeners, make sure to subscribe to this podcast, so you can subscribe on iTunes and other podcast aggregators. We recommend subscribing on Podbean because you get a lot more features that way. You get our podcast artwork and a lot of other nicer options with that. Make sure to subscribe through social media or even email. We send out a weekly newsletter for you to make sure you stay up to date on everything that we do. We don't want you to miss anything. And make sure to join us next week, because next week we will be discussing Elysium. And for further reviews, make sure to check the schedule on the website. That's silverscreenguide.wordpress.com. Go to movies. You'll see a coming soon tab. Make sure to click on that. You'll get the schedule for the rest of the year. And fairly soon, we are in the works right now of discussing a schedule for 2018. So that will be up on the website soon. But as of right now, we've got plenty of reviews to take up your time through the end of this year, and we've got plenty of back material also. So make sure to go through the archives. We've got hours and hours of podcast from different genres, and we have discussions of different kinds. So plenty of content out there. We really want to thank you for your listenership and for subscribing, and we look forward to discussing Elysium with you next time. Blomkamp. I bought